What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Wagon build series, where I take this Cutlass Cruiser wagon that I found in this dude's backyard and start resurrecting this thing. I'm building this car to be my next power tour car. It's getting a turbocharged 3800 with a 5-speed manual transmission and a few other cool things to set this car apart. These cars are super nostalgic to me, so I'm excited to get this thing going. And in this video, I'm going to be modifying this car's suspension to use an airbag suspension system. It's all DIY stuff here, and it's my first time trying anything like this, so it's all new to me. But I can't wait to see how this thing ends up working. We've only got a few weeks left before Power Tour, so without further ado, let's just dive into this project. So as you saw in the title of the video, today I'm going to be putting air ride on the Cutlass wagon. So I have what I think is everything I should need here. I've got a couple of different fittings still in the way, but so here we have the air tank too, which is the most obvious piece of it. This is about a 3.5 gallon tank, so it's a little bit smaller than what most people would run, but I'm not too worried about it. I just want to make sure it fits in the car nicely. I'm going to be doing air ride in all four corners of the car. So we have airbags for the front and airbags for the rear too. So these are the rear airbags, these are the fronts. So this car does use struts. So I had to find a airbag that would fit over the strut, which was difficult to find, but it turns out there's just one company who does this as far as I saw. So I'm going to be using their airbags on this car. And they come with a few different mounting plates here. So we'll walk through that whole process and see how this is all going to fit. Looks like it should all fit nicely. It's pretty close to fitting where it should. Then for the rear, I have these airbags here. So most people would put in like a 6-inch typical double bevel airbag that kind of looks something like this, but with this car, the fitment back here is pretty tight. Fitting a larger airbag back here would be difficult because you have this parking brake mechanism here in the way. You've got your control arm here too. It's just a tight fitment here, so I figured that those would be a little bit better for the car rather than the other ones. So at least that was a thought here for that. So what I'll be doing is I'll be replacing the springs in the rear with the airbags. And as you can see here, there's no way of just placing that airbag inside of here. You'd have to basically make your own brackets, which is what I'm going to end up doing on this car. So we'll figure out the ride height and all that stuff later. Also going to be replacing struts too. I'm also going to be replacing shocks too. So I've got new shocks for the rear. So we'll sort all that stuff out. I'm not using like an off-the-shelf air controller. So I've got 10 different solenoids here I'm going to be using to control the air ride in the car. I've got 2 double gauges over here as well too, and a bunch of air fittings. And then of course the compressor, and then all the check valves, safety valves that you need for it. We're going to dive into this process here, and we're just going to see how far we get. Hopefully we don't run into too many issues. This should be interesting, and then maybe at the end of the video you'll know what it would take to put this on your car if you want to do that whole thing. So this is not intended to be instructional, but you can take from this what you will. I'm not an expert. This is the first time I've ever done air ride. The main reason why I decided to do air ride on this car is that the suspension in the rear is very floaty. It's very saggy already. The springs are basically shot, and you can't just find replacement springs for these that easily, at least an upgraded lowering spring. So the goal is, one, is to make the suspension less saggy, because it is a wagon. There's gonna be a lot of weight in here sometimes, and I don't want this thing to feel like a boat when there's like 100 pounds in the back of the car when I'm hauling tools and stuff on like power tour or road trips. So this car could have a lot of weight in it sometimes, and I just want to make sure that it can handle the weight nicely and without suffering ride quality. And so that's one goal, is to keep the car handling nicely without suffering in ride quality. And then also the other goal is, of course, I'm going to be lowering the car with it. So I can basically set the air ride at whatever height I want to, and then not have to worry about sagging. A lot of people who have tried air ride have switched to coilovers afterwards from what I've seen, but I'm here to give this a shot. I think it could be fun. I think air ride's going to ride really well. At least that's what I've heard from people. So I'm really curious what it's going to be like, and that's really why I wanted to try it. I figured that every car guy, car girl should probably try air ride at one time, and right now this is my time. So I'm going to dive into this project, and we'll start with the rears, work our way to the front, and just see what we can get done with this thing. So stay tuned, and let's just dig into this project. All right, so I've got one of the airbags hooked up to the airline just to kind of see how far it comes out and what that all looks like. So I'm just gonna add some pressure here. See how this goes. Okay, there we go. Nice. Okay, cool. So that's cool. I think. All right, so fully extended, not fully expanded. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, now, and if I push on this thing, I'm assuming it'll just collapse again. Or maybe it won't. We'll see. I'll have to. Okay, maybe I screwed that up, huh? Alright, so I pulled the wheel off. Now I can get a better idea of where this measurement's going to be. It looks like this is going to work out a little bit in my favor here because we have about 1 inch on each side here of the spring perch where it's going to get cut out. So this top part is going to be flat, so that little bubble can go, and that's going to give me a little bit more space on top, and then the bottom we'll figure something out with that too. We may just remove that too as well. This is your lowest possible ride height right here. And if you're down to that ride height, you've got about 1 inch before your mounting point can touch where it needs to. So that's going to be a bit of a monkey wrench in this thing. So I'll measure whatever that distance is, and then I'll just basically build on top of that thing, I think, and then just, basically make my own spring perch. I think I need to cut that one out completely anyway, which is, dude, I don't know how I'm going to do that. So that's tricky. The top side's going to be flat here, and then I'll also have like a, it's going to bolt in somehow. I'm not sure I'm gonna get bolts in there, but somehow I'll get bolts in here and have the airline in here too, so that'll be interesting. So the springs call for a ride height of around 8 inches, so you want this spring to have be extended about 8 inches or so while it's moving down the freeway. So what I'll do here is I'll just shove this thing in here. So if I measure it at the bubble, it looks like it's going to be about 6 inches of the bubbles at the the most compressed ride height, and if we take out 1 inch for the bubble, that puts us at 7 inches, which means that the tire is going to be down here about 1 inch, which is fine. That's pretty good. That seems about right. So I think that's what I'll do. I'll cut out that top bubble and make that whole thing flat somehow, and then somehow maybe cut out some of this bottom one too, and just extend that out as far as I need to. That'll work out where like the most narrow part of this will be on the bottom, where it's in the most danger. I think there is some more danger on top too, but it's nowhere near as much as the bottom. Main thing is that brake line, which can be bent if it needs to be. This parking brake cable is where it is. It's not getting moved. There's no way. So in addition to the minimum ride height as well as the traveling ride height, there's also a maximum extension of these springs, because obviously you don't want to destroy them. You don't want to extend them too much, because then you could rip that whole thing off of it, rip the whole bladder off of it. The maximum extension is 11 inches. And it looks like we're probably going to be okay. So what I've done is I put the shock on here right where it's going to be. If I put this all the way up here, it looks like this lands right at about 9.5 inches. And if we account for the other 1 inch that we're gaining here by taking off this bubble, then we land at 10.5 inches or so. So I think that's going to work out pretty spot on, pretty perfectly. And I won't need to use like a limit strap or anything like that. I will probably want to put in a bump stop somewhere, but otherwise, so this is going to be the perfect spring for this car. Didn't expect that. This was kind of a swag. So I think I have an idea of what this is going to look like. So I'll just remember it's 6 inches, and then we can just drop this whole thing now. Give us plenty of space here to work through this thing and figure out what this is going to look like. So that helps out a ton. What have I got myself into? The good news is, though, is that the rear is going to be the hardest part of this whole thing. Like, the front should come together easily, I think. So we'll see how that goes, but we'll take a stab at this. We'll get there one step at a time and make something work here. Alright, so I've got the spring perches kind of modified here to take off that center section of them. that would center the spring. Cutting this top one out was a huge pain in the butt. It was awkward. Getting the angle grinder up here was pretty sketchy, but at least I was able to get this thing somewhat flat, and at least a surface that's somewhat weldable too. This one here I just cut out from the bottom, as you saw there, so that worked out better than expected. So it takes a certain size cutoff wheel to do it. You can see that the new ones just are too big for it, but that's why you keep the small ones around, so you can still get inside of there. So that worked out fairly well, but now I need to make new perches for the new springs. So basically what I need to do is fill in this whole section with a new flat piece of steel, fill in this top one too, and cut some holes in there so that way I can actually bolt the spring in there. So the way it's going to work is at the top of the spring is this section here. So that's going to go on top for me on this car, and this will go in the bottom still somewhere. So I'll need to make a flat plate, and then this will just kind of bolt on there, and that'll work out fairly well. It'll bolt on top too, so I need to make a plate for that as well too. So I've got to make 2 plates now, one for the bottom, one for the top, and the top one's going to have to be this diameter. The bottom one's going to have to be at least this diameter over here to fill in that whole section, and I'll just weld it in from the bottom. You know, it's been a huge mess, but we're making progress, and soon eventually here we'll have at least the rear is done. This is the one that keeps me up at night sometimes when I think about the airbag setup, because it's hard to fit these things in here. It needed so much modification, but I think we're coming up on the home stretch now. We've got a path forward. We're halfway through the tunnel. So okay, so I've got my first version of these spring perches kind of sorted out here. Basically what's going to happen is this is the bottom spring perch, and I'll probably weld it to the bottom half of this thing. That way it stays perfectly flat, and kind of just set that thing in there to fill that spot. And I'll just weld around it until it fills that hole. That should be okay. And then the top ones will come up here somewhere and kind of fill this spot and somehow make it flat inside of here. So that'll be the goal of that. All right, so I've got my little plate welded in here, 360, and the more I welded this thing, the more heat I gave it, the more I realized this thing is smoking. It is falling apart. I just started poking this thing with the pliers, and the more I poked it, the more I found all these rust holes. And now I'm realizing that this bracket in the car is just not going to be up to the task of taking this kind of weight again. This thing is retired. This thing is done. So basically, I can't use this thing the way it is right now, at least in that bottom plate. Now I could reinforce it, but also now I'm realizing too that because of this, you know, abrupt change here, I can't use this thing the way I thought I would, because it's just not smooth enough for the airbag to ride in that thing and bump into it. This could basically pierce open that airbag and cause a blowout. This rough, sharp edge here, I can try and grind this thing down, but it's too tight in here to be able to do that. Solution obviously is going to be to basically make a whole new bottom plate for this thing. The pieces on the side are fine. It's just the bottom piece itself that's the issue. So yeah, this kind of fell apart a little bit more than I thought it would. But you know, we won't make the same mistake on the other side. We'll do this here, figure it out here, replicate the same thing over there, and hopefully have something that's going to be reliable here in the end, because you don't want to have a blowout here. I want this thing to be very trustworthy and not have any concerns about anything here at all. All right, so I've got my spring perches made. These are the new ones. These are going to go and replace the old ones. Got the old ones cut out, and this side was definitely a lot worse than the other side was. The other side actually was probably okay, but still have to make sure that they're the same side to side. And the other side would still have the same issue this one has, where it's still, you know, this raised edge that's sharp that could pierce the bag. So we'll go to a flat piece here that even if it touches this, it's going to be just fine. It's going to be a nice, even, soft touch with no sharp edges. So here we have both pieces, and I think that this is the passenger or the driver's side right here. And basically, they'll just go in here, slide in, and gotta get it under the bolt. Get it right about right there. I will have a gap to fill, so that's not going to be amazing, but basically I'm going to be 1/8 of an inch higher than the old one, so it's going to sit kind of where the old one sat, kind of just like that. So it's going to sit basically where the old one sat, just a little bit higher. It'll sit on parts of the old one. Then over here I'll need to just bridge that gap in this side and weld it to that plate here. That's that reinforcement piece. And I'll probably go back on the underside here afterwards. Depending on how strong this feels, I might just like do another, another gusset down the bottom half of this just to make sure it's even stronger, because the old spring would have been sitting on this outside surface, whereas a new one, it's going to be sitting on the inside surface. So it's more pressure farther away from the edges. So it could cause this thing to bend a little bit more than expected. So I might just add another brace somewhere along the middle. I'm not sure, just outside of where the bolt's at. But we'll see how this fits here, how that all ends up looking. I'll just go ahead and start burning this thing in, make this thing look decent, and make it strong again. Make it a good, solid piece that will support an airbag and at least 1,500 pounds. Right? Right. That's the goal. So. All right, so I finally got both sides welded on here. It's a bit of a mess right now. This was a lot rustier than I thought it'd be, so I had a lot of trouble getting some good welds in this thing. But overall, though, it's gonna clean up nicely. I may go ahead and go in the backside and just add some more braces there, but otherwise, though, I think we've got something that's gonna work out here just fine. So once again, a little sloppy, but it's good enough for who it's for. So I think the bottom sides are basically ready to go for the next step, which is going to be basically just drilling the holes and obviously cleaning this thing up, making it look good. And then for the tops here, I think I've decided that I'm basically going to cut out the old mounts up top too, and just weld in new material all around it, because we're going to be lowering the whole thing quite a bit. I'd like to actually get my fingers in here to be able to screw those bolts in. That way I'm not just trying to like squeeze a wrench in this tiny little pocket here, which is going to be just a nightmare. So I think that that's going to help out, or at least I'll shape off like from here to here, inside of this rail here of the frame, and then up here, and then just weld some braces back in here or something. We'll keep plugging away at this thing. This is taking a little bit longer than I thought it would, but we're going to have a very unique car at the end of this. It's going to be something else that like most people don't really tend to do. So, all right, so at this point now, I've got my holes drilled for the springs. I centered them up in here. I think this is a pretty good spot for it. It seems to put that spring kind of right in the middle there, and that seems pretty safe. So I think that that's all good. I basically put this where the old spring was. I basically just centered it, measured this diameter here, and just figured out where the middle of this was. And then just use these cutouts to figure out what the difference was in all this. So I landed about right there, which seems to be pretty good. So with the bottom spring mount settled in, now I need to figure out how I'm going to mount these top ones here. And this is going to be the trickiest part of this swap. So I think I've realized, based on my math and knowing what these springs are, so for reference, it's a RideTech 9002, which happens to be a Firestone spring. And it seems like this is going to work out for this swap, for this suspension setup. One of the things that you'll notice is there's different angles, right? So right now, with this thing at full travel, it's never going to get this far down, by the way. Under normal operating conditions, there's no way it could. This side of the spring is going to be taller than this side on the bottom, so there's going to be different heights there. So what I found was that if I place this thing in here, the lowest side of it, the most extended side of it, is still going to be within the spring specs. If I place this thing out here with a 1.5 inch spacer, based off of the shock travel, so the shock is the limiting factor here. It limits the extension and it limits the compression. So with that shock here, the factory shock, this thing should work in the space here with about a 1.5 inch spacer on the top of this. So I need to bring the top of this spring mount down by 1.5 inches, which is good because this means I can find a place to mount these little holes in here, because there's no way I'm going to be able to get to them through here. It's going to be so tight. I mean, it's possible, but it's going to be so tight. So if I bring the whole thing down, which it's going to end up being about right here, somewhere around there, that gives me more possibility of accessing these little holes there. So I need to figure out how to make a mount now for this thing, which is the real tricky part. I think what's going to happen is I will basically throw something in here that's 1.5 inches or so, like maybe like a 1.5 inch exhaust pipe or something, just to make sure I get the proper placement down, and then figure out how I'm going to weld in this little plate here. And then somehow this thing will get placed in here somewhere around there, I think. I think what needs to happen though is I think I need to cut this whole assembly out of here to make more room for me to access this. I think I'm going to cut it basically right where the rail is on here, and hopefully I don't nick this brake line again. All right, so I got that piece cut out, and no going back now, right? So this helps me see the spring perch a lot more easily now, so I can actually see and measure out where this is going to be a whole lot easier. And what I have right now is that the axle is set at the lowest height it could possibly go. So, most extended. So the shock here is stopping it from going even further. It's not bolted in right now. It's just kind of held in. So there's no bolt on the top of it, but this is about where it's going to be. And just measuring out where this spring is going to be, because it looks like according to my measurements, I think things were just not measured correctly or something, because there's something going on here that's not making a lot of sense. I've got all my measurements right here, so at bottomed out, it's like 19 and 7/8 or so. Sorry, I've messed that thing up quite a bit. Fully tucked, about 18.5 inches. That's about where the tire starts to hit the fender. So the fender's going to need to get rolled to make that actually work out. At about a 1-inch gap, it's 16 7/8, and the lowest I want to go or highest I want to go for the ride height would be 15 and 7/8, I think. For the spring heights, that ends up being right around here or so. So the lowest possible is 6 5/8, which is a lot lower than I thought it'd be. And that's with this right here. So, which if I'm doing my math, that means that to go from 6 5/8 to a 5.5-inch spring, I mean, this can only compress about 5.5 inches. At least that's what it looks like. They say online it'll go further, but I don't know how it's going to happen, because it's just going to roll over on itself, and I don't think you want that, right? So, I'm not so sure about that, so I kind of want to play on the safe side. Once again, I'm kind of new to this, so I don't think I can go a little smaller than or larger than a 1-inch spacer. And what I'm seeing here for the lowest possible height, or the full extension, so this seems to be about the lowest possible measurement I can get for the lowest height there, and it's kind of sitting right there, so it's lower than it really will be, but that puts this thing right at about 12.5 inches. It looks like I'm going to have to use a limiting strap. I don't know. It's all very weird. So fully extended, the spring can only go to 11 inches. So that puts the spring height about right here or so. So that's not great. Can think about this for a second. Okay, so I finally given in here. I think I'm gonna put it in the 1.5-inch spacer, because I don't want to put a limiting strap in the back too. I didn't want to put the car any higher off the ground than it is right there. So that's kind of the gap that I'm looking at right now. This was like my highest point. But the more I look at it, the more I'm okay with it. And the more I think about it, I realize that if I'm going down the freeway, this is probably a more safe ride height than where I wanted to put it. And this is within where that spring wants to be anyway, so I might as well just run it like this, right? So that'll be safer on the freeway. And then as I go through like car shows and stuff, I can always lower it down to a little bit higher than that, and get the car pretty much tucked here if I want to. So I think that's going to work out. I think that's the plan. They're not perfect, but it's where it's going to be. So that gives me about a 7.5-inch ride height on the spring itself. So I think that's going to work out all right. And it's still lower than it is from the factory, so the car is still going to be lowered, but we're going to end up with a gap right about something like this. And it is off-centered on here, but I think this is about where it's going to be. So I think I'm okay with that. I think it's going to be cool. So the only real risk here now is that this puts the spring at 5 1/8 at the lowest possible point when it's fully compressed and on the bump stops. Now the spring, I can get this thing down to 5.5 inches and it'll hit, basically like this. The spring itself will be on the ground. And it's still not as low as they say it can go. They say it can go lower. I don't know how it can go lower, but I'm new to this, so maybe I should just trust their numbers. Maybe it'll be fine. It's going to roll somewhere. I'm not sure how that's going to go, but no, I'm not the expert. They're the experts, so I think we'll do that. And all right, so I've been playing with this thing for a while, and I think I've got a solution here. So I'm going to start off with this vertical plate that will basically hug the whole frame, and that'll give this that vertical support and really set the height of this thing where it needs to be to start off with. And then also I've got this plate here too with the spring mounts to drill all the holes for it. So I've got 2 at each side. I did start off with some round pieces, but looking at this thing more and more, I think I've decided that the square piece or the rectangular piece is really going to be the move to make in this thing to really, get this thing right where it needs to be. My plan here is, so I'll tack weld this thing in here once I figure out where this is all going to sit. I think we're pretty close to where it's going to be. I just need to go back in here and clean all this stuff up. I have to grind out some of that frame rails so that way I have a solid piece to weld to, something that's clean, because I want to make sure these welds are actually really nice, or at least nice enough that they're not going to break And so then after that, once I have this thing kind of tacked in here and welded where it needs to be, I'll go ahead and just make a rail here. It comes out to this side and then maybe like boxed in this whole thing. And then somewhere maybe like right in the middle here, I'll have a piece that goes up vertically and just grabs this whole thing. This way I can still get to the sides of this with the wrench and get to this thing with the wrench too. That's the trick, is just making sure I can get to these things still with the wrench somehow. I also want to make sure this whole thing stays protected still, because airlines are going to come in through here, and I think they're going to go, I don't think they'll go up this way, but my thought was they're going to go back here somewhere. I'm not sure where they're going to go yet, but I just want to make sure that they're protected no matter where I put them, and having that brace here on the outside will help out with that. All right, so I've got both sides kind of cleaned up here. Got this down to bare metal. Got some body filler here, some seam sealer there, which is awful smelling to weld through, but now I've got a good solid surface to actually penetrate into, so I think that we should have some pretty good outcomes out of this. And so we'll start with this piece that goes up here, put the plate on there, and then just kind of figure out where the rest of it's all going to sit. The real trick here is just making sure I protect everything. This side is not a big deal. There's only like this, you've got this brake line here, and you've got that fuel line there, but the other side has tons of fuel lines, brake lines, so I'll just wrap some tin foil in all of it, and that'll protect all of that from the weld spatter, I think. Once that's in here, I think the rest of this should fall together pretty quickly on the rear end. So I'll go ahead and bolt in a new panhard bar. I got a new one here for the car, and we'll get this thing sorted. Okay, so I did go ahead and replace the old panhard bar. This thing is obviously 30 years old or whatever. Pretty worn out. These bushings are basically shot on this thing, so the new one was like a couple, like 30, 40 bucks or something, so I figured I might as well go for it. So here we are, we got a new one. It's a solid piece. It's no C-channel at all. It's all just one round tubular piece, and look how shiny that is. Yeah. All right, so I've got my first pad on here, just kind of, well, it is pretty much fully welded, at least as far as that vertical piece goes. And it already feels super strong, so I feel really good about this so far. It is still pretty hot. The top welds were kind of messy. It is what it is. It's not as clean as I had hoped it would be, but it's strong. It's way better than these spot welds are gonna be anyway. So I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and burn in the other side too. Then from there, I'll start cutting some pieces, template some of this stuff out, and figure out how I'm gonna tie this to this piece too. With that tied to that piece, this thing will basically be solid. All right, so I've got this side done too. So it is a little bit messy because welding upside down is difficult, and plus you really can't get that welder nozzle in there. And then I forgot to turn the heat back up on one side, but otherwise this thing it's hot. It's in here pretty solid though. We're one step closer to making this thing in. So next step here is to build some braces. So I'll go ahead and just start playing with some cardboard, figure out what that looks like, and start making that out of metal, and we'll get this thing sorted. All right, so I know it's a little sloppy looking, but it's gonna do the job. It's gonna be pretty strong. So I've got these little braces put in here on this side too to kind of give this thing some more structural strength side to side here. That way this whole lip on this side doesn't just like pry itself up somehow or fall down. So this way it's a lot more rigid. We still have this one here too as well, so I think that this is gonna be a pretty good setup. The biggest struggle is just trying to make sure that nothing hits the airbag and I can actually still reach my fingers in here and put these bolts in, take them out, get this one in here. I also went ahead and drilled a hole in each side for the airline. I figured the airline should just go straight back and side of there. That way it's not going back in the wheel well. And I'll just put a grommet inside of that. So I put like a 3/8 inch hole there, and that'll give that airline somewhere to go. So at this point, I think the brackets in the back are basically done. So I can just go ahead and paint these things and wrap this side up, and then we can get started in the fronts. So I think I'm going to call it a night here, though, with that. I'll throw some paint in this thing, and I think after that, we'll call it a night. Get started in the fronts tomorrow, hopefully. This is what I think is everything involved with converting this car to an air ride suspension in the front of it. I have a factory replacement strut for the car. Also bought these universal airbags. So these are like the only airbags I was able to find out there that actually have, you know, a center that's hollow for a coilover type of setup or a strut type of setup. Originally, I was going to do like a coilover thing in the car where I was like going to adjust the air ride on top of the coilover, but these things have like this little tube in here, so it was interfering with the coilover, so I returned those, and now I'm just going to be making this work basically on the stock strut, so I'll save a couple $100 by doing it this way. These airbags are not cheap. They're like $500 or something like that. It was kind of ridiculous, but I guess it's just the price you pay for cool stuff. Hopefully this is cool. From what I've been reading online, a lot of people are switching back to coilovers from using airbags just because of the ride quality, supposedly, or like the spring rates are just, you know, not as configurable as they are for coilover. So I'm going to try it, though, and see how this works out. I think that this should be pretty good. At least, you know, I want to at least have tried air ride, right, on all four corners and see how that goes. The car is going to get lowered anyway, and it would be nice to be able to just configure, you know, what that ride height is on the fly. So I'm going to be doing airbags in the front, or at least trying to here. So here's all the parts involved with that. So here we have a spacer for the strut for the airbag. I will be using this somewhat. I'm going to shave it down quite a bit. Then we also have this bottom mount piece. This actually comes with the airbag. Actually, this does too, and so does the top piece as well. So this is the top piece for the airbag, and you can see here it has that airport on this side of it, so this side would go down. On this car, it took me a while to figure this out because, once again, I've never had this car before. Like, I've never taken one of these apart, so this is all new to me. But the way that this works in this car for the strut mount is that there's two pieces to the strut mount itself. You can't buy this piece new. You've got to take it off of the car, at least from what I've seen. I haven't found it new anywhere. And that gets attached to the strut mount itself. So typically, your spring would basically sit on top of this thing, and this takes all the load of the spring, then transfers it to the strut mount. And it took me a while to figure this out, but the strut mount itself has a bearing inside of it. So this is your bearing that rotates, and this sits on it, and that's why that's important. So that's why I need to keep using this thing. So it's a fairly simple setup. We don't have too many pieces here. We just have, you know, the air spring itself plus its parts, plus a stock style strut mount and strut, and this should work pretty well. So my plan here is to go ahead and throw this riser on here. I'm going to shave this down quite a bit. Basically, the whole point of this thing, for me at least, is to just get this thing flat, so that way this thing can go on here flat too. So this thing is going to get shaved down as far as it can possibly go to get this thing flat on this surface, and I'm not going to bother trimming this thing up at all because I think it's going to work out okay as it is. And then so this will go in here, basically something like that. It's going to be a little bit further down. It'll probably be like right here or something. And then the airbag will come on here next, so it'll just slide in here and get bolted into this side here. And then over here we have the top mount for it, which will go on next. And then we have the strut mount. So after that, the top piece goes in. And this top piece is kind of weird because it has these little tabs here that are folded upwards. I don't remember what the purpose was for those. But I've got to bend these back down over because this thing is going to sit on the surface and it's going to bend them down anyway, even if I don't, because, you know, 1,500 pounds on each corner possibly is going to be a lot of weight to, you know, it's going to push it down on its own. So I think that will settle out this piece. This is like the biggest wild card of it. And then also the strut will just go on after that. So it'll be basically something like this. So mostly like a factory type of setup here, and then finally you have your strut mount itself. And that's pretty much all there is to it. That's your whole assembly right there. That should bolt right in basically after you do some modification to this piece and to this piece. So before I go ahead and start assembling this thing and figure out where this bottom spring is going to be, I need to figure out where this is going to sit in the car, what the ride height is going to be. Now that I don't have a spring in here, it's going to make this really easy to figure out what that's going to look like. So what I'll do is I'll jack up the other side of the car and rely on the sway bar to pick up this side of the car. And then I'll use my wheel fitment tester again and figure out what that ride height is going to be with the wheel gap, and get all that stuff sorted out. And then with the wheel gap tester, and then with the I don't have any wheels yet, but I can still use that wheel fitment tester to figure out where that tire is going to sit against the fender and against the strut, and I think we'll get a pretty good idea of what that ride height will be. Then with that, I can figure out how much of this spacer I need to keep, whether it's shaping the whole thing down flat or if I keep it kind of high. We'll see what that all looks like here. So go ahead and raise up the car, figure out what this looks like, throw on that wheel fitment tester. All right, so the front of the car looks like it's going to be a little bit taller than I want it to be. It looks like this is kind of about where it might sit or so. I'm not really sure, but this is kind of middle of the spring compression. So it looks like my max compression is about 3/4 of an inch before this hits the fender, and then from there I can lower this thing 2 inches and get it right here, which is a bit more fender gap than I want. But once again, freeway travel is going to be different than car shows showing this thing off, so maybe it'll still be fine. It's probably a good mix to get it that way. So we'll see what this all looks like here once I account for the spring perch itself, because right now I'm just measuring to the lip of this thing, so there is still this lip right here that I need to worry about. This is kind of what we're looking at right there, so that's your ride height right there. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and measure this at the very edge of the shock travel, I suppose, and see what that all looks like. All right, so I've stared at this thing way too long, measured this thing back and forth so many different times, and I think I've just been overcomplicating this whole thing. So I've basically decided to ignore what they call for the ride height for this thing, and just kind of whatever this thing lands is where it lands, because I'm not going to get the most ideal ride height anyway, so might as well just kind of roll with it. So I think I've decided what the breakdown is going to be now. So it's going to be basically, obviously we have the strut, all these components right here. I went ahead and just hammered this thing down because I need the spring to mount this thing flat. So this thing is going to be basically my top retainer plate for the spring. And I think I'm going to throw this thing in here too as well. I'm going to retain the factory bump stop, but I'm going to have to trim this thing down quite a bit. It is way too tall. And what I really want to keep here is, I want this thing to be bottomed out at 3/4 of an inch. And where this is at right now, it's really going to be bottomed out more like, it would be like a 2.5 inch bottom out, which is like, that's pretty much where I want the ride height to be. So that's not great. So I don't want this thing riding on bump stops all the time. So I'm going to cut the bump stop down probably somewhere around this middle bump stop thing right there. And it will change the spring rate on this thing, but as long as I don't cut through this part of it and retain this section there, I think we'll be okay. I also need to go around the outer edge of this thing and basically reduce the outer diameter of it, probably with a hole saw or something. I'm not really sure how I'm going to do that yet, but I think a hole saw could work for it, because this is too wide. And the way this is going to work is that this is going to have to go inside of this thing. And if this thing is bottoming out, that means that this little ring inside of here is going to come up all the way too. So I don't want this thing to get jammed up inside of here and kind of get stuck somehow. And right now you can see it's going to get stuck. It's too far. There's too much diameter here for this to go inside of it. So that's kind of how that's going to go. So this will go inside of there. This spring plate will go on top of here. This is the strut mount itself, and the strut mount gives it all the rotation it needs. So that way when you take corners and stuff, and the wheels turn, this can turn independently of the rest of the car, just like it would from the factory. I might throw on this top spring plate. I'm not sure yet if I want to throw this in here. I don't think it needs the extra strength, but it might be good to have that there just in case. If I do that though, this thing needs to get drilled out so this can sit inside of it. So that's something that I need to figure out how I'm going to do. All right, so I've got my first collar done here basically. It fits pretty well, so I'm just tracing this thing with some paper. What I'm doing is I've got this paper lined up against the bottom of it, and I'm just going to go around and just bend this thing in, and it should leave like a little mark here inside of it as I go ahead and do that, and I'll just use that to cut it out. And then I'll have a nice little piece of paper I can use on this one too, so I can just duplicate the exact same thing and have a pretty good size of stuff here. So I'll have a little template for it. Okay, so when I unrolled it, it came out like this. So now I have my little marks I can use to just cut this thing up, and then once I put this on this piece, I can just use a marker, trace it out, and we'll be all set. All right, so I'm going to be welding onto the strut. Now, I'm not welding onto the strut body itself. I'm welding onto this perch here. So just to be safe and to not do any damage here, I'm going to be careful with this weld. I'm going to go slowly with it. And also, like, I'm going to dunk this thing in water every so often, just to make sure that there's not going to be any sort of issue with this. So I'll do like a little bit of a stitch, dunk it, work on the other one, stitch it, dunk it, work on the other one, stitch it, and so on. So I'll go ahead and start welding these things on here and see how that all works out. All right, so I've got these things welded on here, got a pretty good amount of bead on these things, and I'm hoping that this is enough. You can see I didn't get the back side of these things basically at all. It's just too tight of a fit for the welder. And I got this side done pretty well, so both sides are done. I've probably got at least 180 degrees worth of weld, maybe a little bit more here. So I think that should be good. It's only going to have vertical forces in these things, so I think that we'll be in okay shape for this. I don't want to risk welding these things any more than I already have, just because it is a gas-filled strut, and it seems like a pretty dangerous thing to be welding on. I know you're not supposed to weld in the bodies of these things. Didn't weld in the body, welded in the perch, but still, that heat could transfer, and that could be pretty bad. But so yeah, I think these are basically done. So I'll go ahead and just wire wheel these things off, paint these things, and I'll paint this one to match this one. I don't know why they're different colors. Different sources. They're still the same shock, so they're both KYB GR2s. I think this is an older one, this is a newer one, I'm not really sure, but they are both new, so they should both be fine. So don't know why they did that, but it is what it is. All right, so for the front struts, the next thing that needs to be modified is going to be these bump stops, right? So these bump stops are a bit too long right now. We do need to keep bump stops in the car, so my options were to find something aftermarket that would fit or just modify these, and I think that's what I'm going to do. So right now, the issue is that these bump stops are too wide to fit inside of the pipe, and I need to make sure they fit inside of that pipe. So what I'll do is I'm going to take a hole saw to both of these things and trim off some material on the outside of this thing, so that way it'll fit inside of that hole. And then once I have it inside of the hole, I can figure out if it's too long or not. And what I'll probably end up doing is I'll probably end up cutting this thing somewhere around here in this middle row here. So I think that's what needs to happen to get the lowest ride height I can possibly get without rolling the fenders. But I'm not trying to get that low on this car right now, just because these fender liners, they cover this whole thing, and I don't really want to lose a fender liner that much right now. So I think I'm going to retain these fender liners. I don't know, maybe they'll come out. I don't know. I could pull them out, actually. I don't know. But I can always come back here, modify this later even more, cut off even more. You can't add material without buying new ones. So I'll go ahead and cut these down and see what that looks like and figure out what that length is going to be. All right, so paint's still a little wet in these things, but I think I'm going to put these things together anyway, just because I'm already here. We'll go ahead and start assembling these struts and get these springs in here, figure out how much I need to cut this down, because I will need to cut that down a little bit further still, but we can at least kind of figure this stuff out as we go along and get this thing sorted out. So here's the spring, and we'll just go ahead and throw this on here. We have that fitting there on this side of it, so that's going to go right there basically. Then we have these small 3/8 coarse thread bolts that are going in here. Now the trick is just line this whole thing up until you feel it. So I got the threads started here, so they're just kind of in there. Nice thing to do is start to throw on these top pieces. So here's one of my top plates. You can see I welded some washers here. I don't think I need to add any additional ones, but that might be something I end up doing here. So this is gonna get this thing inside of it, and now the trick is figuring out, okay, well, how much of this thing needs to go in there at least. Looking at this depth there, I'm thinking it's going to go in at least a 1/2 inch. Let me get the caliper out though. I can get this more accurate here. 43/64. And then this thing is going to be about the same actually. 11/16 in here too. Okay, so it looks like I'm going to be cutting it right at the top of this middle one here. So yeah, so I'll start with that and see how that goes. I'm relying on the bump stop to bottom out the car instead of the spring plate here where this center tube would hit it. So that's kind of important. I know these will compress quite a bit. I think it's like 4.5 inches or so. So, we're just going to try and make sure that we hit that with this thing. All right, so I got these cut down this far. I ended up just taking that one rib off of these things. I think that's a good starting point at least. And it's going to give me at least another 1/2 inch or an inch of movement here. So they will go inside of these strut top plates. So I don't know what you would call this, but it's like the spring perch for the old ones. And like we don't need most of this material here at all. We just need the center piece. But so these things will just snap into these little tabs inside of here. So you can see them there. There's a couple of them. And you can see this thing's been worn out quite a bit. It's gone through this thing a lot. So we'll just go ahead and shove it in there. Okay, there we go. So it's in there now. And I'm going to rotate it just because we have some pieces that are chewed off of it. So we'll put it in a section that's not too much of an issue. So that's what that's going to look like. That's my bump stop. That's my spring perch. So this thing will bolt into this. So we have our bolts here. So I'm using some socket cap screws for these. It's like the only way I could make this clear this little corner here in this because it's so tight inside of these things. So here's one strut. And this will just go in here. The top direction doesn't matter at all for these. So we'll just go ahead and throw this thing in here. And get these bolts lined up. So yeah, this thing is basically assembled now. I've got my air fitting on here now. And I've got all the bolts in here. The only thing I'm concerned about is just alignment with the strut mount. But otherwise, this is all pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw a strut mount on here just to see what this looks like. So here's one of them. This is the last piece to make this thing a hill strut. Okay. And as you can see here, the strut mount is quite a bit higher than the spring is, but once the spring inflates, it'll fill up this space too. So right now it's just decompressed. It's not going to fill it up, but I am going to test this to see what this looks like. So I will put the bolt in here and then we'll throw an airline in this, see how this inflates. All right, so this is what the spring looks like, fully inflated. It's got about 80 PSI in it right now. And once it's on the car, it's not gonna be this tall, but just showing here that it does fill that whole space. So if this thing does, somehow get decompressed somehow off the car, it's still not going to come loose. It's going to be all right, and it won't fall out of place here at all or anything like that. So top piece does move still independently of the bottom, so that's awesome. That's great. So when you go around corners and stuff, you can still turn your tires without binding up the shock and binding up the air spring. So I think with that, the front springs are basically done. You can throw them in the car and get this thing one step closer to being finished. All right, so struts are in the car now finally, but yeah, we're looking good here. These are a little bit loose in here right now just because there's no air in them, but once there's air in these things, we're not gonna have an issue with that at all. The fitting on the airline seems to clear things well enough, at least. So the airbag is kind of close to the frame, but it's not close enough that it's going to be an issue, at least that I can see so far. And if it is, I can just bring the camber further out, because right now I've got the camber all the way out for more negative camber. So I don't know how much it is, but I know about 3 degrees is a pretty good amount of negative camber for most cars. And this car is not going to be like a handling machine anyway, but we're gonna at least give it a fighting chance of handling nicely. So at this point, all the airbags are in the car. We got the fronts and the rears in here right now. And this car is officially on air ride, albeit there is no compressor yet, or air tanks, or solenoids, or lines, or anything like that. But this car is officially on air ride right now. So something I never thought I'd be doing, but I'm excited for it. All right, so at this point, with these airbags done in the front, I'm gonna go ahead and test things out in the rear. Now, there is no wheels yet for this car. I don't have the wheels and tires yet, so I can't put this on the ground, so I'm sorry. I know you wanna see that. I know you wanna see this thing move with the airbags, but we'll at least test the rears and make this car move somewhat. So we'll just see how that goes. All right, so the airbags are in. And they're plumbed up, at least to themselves. They're not plumbed up in the car. That's going to be a whole thing, you know, so I'm not going to do that quite yet. But here you can see it's mounted in the car. It's bolted in. I did have to use quite a few washers in this thing to make this actually bolt in properly. There's not much thread here, and the shortest bolt that you can find at Lowe's is like a 3/4 inch. So couldn't find a 1/2 inch, but, you know, I was able to make do with this. Got some thread lock in there, some blue stuff, and I think we should be golden here. Got the new shocks in, new panhard bar. And what I want to do now is I want to see this thing work. I want to see it make some noises. So I have both air lines plumbed into this little this splitter here, and going into the air compressor. There's no air in it yet right now, but I just want to see if this thing lifts the car up and what that looks like, and just to make sure that everything is actually gonna work. So I'm gonna put my jack in the center of the car. I did notice that these things are just long enough as they are to actually like fit in here properly. It's not rolling on itself. It's not rolling out all the way. So that's good news. I was really worried about that. And so once I put some weight in here, with this. Cool. All right, so now there's basically no pressure in this thing at all. It's 30 PSI. I think under normal operating conditions, this will be like 60, 70 PSI. You can see here the bag is inflated on both sides here, so this is just this one side, and it rolled out nicely. There's no kinks or anything like that in there, so that's good. I was concerned about that. All right, so let's go ahead and see if this will pick up the car. Oh man, that's cool. All right, that is 60 PSI. It picks up at 60. That's cool. Dude. That's awesome. Dude. Oh, that's amazing. Yes, that's so cool. All right, so the rears are looking pretty good. I mean, this thing moves up and down on its own, so that's really freaking awesome. I'm excited for this thing. I've never, it's so cool how it just moves like that, you know, with just a flip of the knobs. So I'm excited to see how this works in the car, but that'll have to be another video because there's so much more to get done still. Like, we've got to mount the tank, we've got to mount the compressor, figure out how the solenoids are going to fit, how they're going to get the lines in the car. So all that's going to come in a future video. This was a lot of work for this one, so thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned. We're going to keep going with this thing, and we're going to try and get this thing working soon. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.